She was 31 years old, and by the time the bank finished with her, she owned nothing but the clothes on her back, and a handful of coins too small to matter. Her husband, Caleb Winter, had died of typhoid the previous winter, and within the year, the Wells Fargo agent representing the Larkspur Trust Bank had come to collect on a debt Caleb had never told her existed, a loan taken against their small dairy farm outside Larkspur, Montana territory, that she had no way to repay. The bank took the farm, the cows, and even the modest house, leaving her only the strange, small mercy of a structure so unwanted that no one at the auction had bothered to bid on it, a squat, windowless icehouse standing derelict at the edge of the property, its double-walled timber frame packed with sawdust and its roof half-caved from a decade of neglect. She bought it back from the bank herself, for $2, the whole of what remained in her purse, and townsfolk, who watched Nora Winter hand over her last coin for a building, meant to hold nothing but blocks of frozen pond water, called it the saddest kind of foolishness. A widow clinging to scraps because she had nothing else left to cling to. They did not know that packed deep in the sawdust beneath the icehouse floor, wrapped and waiting for over 20 years, rested a diary that would not only give Nora Winter back her life, but would heal 2 families this whole valley had watched break apart in silence. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Winter. If you have ever held on to something small because it was all you had left, and later found it was worth more than anyone guessed, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Nora had been born Nora Ellery in the autumn of 1860, in a modest farmhouse in the Larkspur Valley, Montana territory, in the years when the valley was still mostly open range, and a family's fortunes rose or fell with the harvest and the health of the herd. Her father, Silas Ellery, ran a small dairy operation, one of the first in the valley, and it was he who built the very icehouse that would, decades later, become his daughter's entire inheritance, cutting great blocks of ice each winter from the frozen bend of Larkspur Creek and packing them in sawdust to keep milk and butter cool through the scorching Montana summers. Nora grew up watching her father tend that icehouse with a care that seemed, to a child, almost reverent, checking the packing each week, replacing sawdust that had gone damp, guarding the temperature the way another man might guard a strongbox. And it was from him that she learned the lesson that would come to define her whole life, though she could not have named it as a lesson at the time. Ice looks like nothing at all once it's buried in sawdust, her father would tell her, wiping his hands on his canvas apron. Folks walk right past an icehouse and see a plain little shed. They never think about what's keeping cold and steady underneath, doing its quiet work where nobody's watching. Nora absorbed this more deeply than her father intended, and she began to apply it far beyond the icehouse itself, noticing how the plainest, least remarkable things in the valley, a cracked churn, a neglected corner of pasture, a person others dismissed as unremarkable, often held some steady, useful worth that simply wasn't visible from the road. Her mother, Margaret Ellery, gave her a different but complementary gift, an unshakable belief that the valley's families, for all their squabbles over water rights and grazing lines, were bound together in ways that mattered more than any single dispute. Margaret had midwifed half the babies born in Larkspur in her years there, and she raised Nora with the conviction that a community's health depended on people remembering their debts to one another, not merely debts of money, but debts of kindness, the kind that could not always be repaid in coin, but needed repaying all the same. It was Margaret who first told Nora, in careful, half-finished sentences, about the Doyle family, the Ellery's nearest neighbors and closest friends in the valley's earliest years, a bond that had curdled into cold silence, sometime before Nora was old enough to understand why. Thaddeus Doyle had been Silas Ellery's dearest friend, the 2 men having settled adjoining parcels the same spring and helped raise each other's barns. But something had gone wrong between the families when Nora was still an infant, some falling out so bitter that the Doyles had eventually sold their land and left the valley entirely, and neither of Nora's parents would ever speak plainly of what had caused it. Margaret would only say, turning her hands over in her lap the way she did when a subject pained her, that a terrible misunderstanding had come between 2 good families, and that she did not believe either side had ever gotten the whole truth of it. Nora filed the comment away, the way she filed away everything her mother said, with that particular careful weight, sensing without understanding that it might matter to her one day. Life in the Larkspur Valley moved to the rhythm of the seasons, calving in spring, haying in summer, the ice harvest each deep winter, when Silas and the hired men would cut great glistening blocks from the creek and haul them by sledge to the Icehouse, packing them in sawdust so thick and careful that the ice would last, properly tended, clear through to the following winter. Nora grew from a watchful child into a young woman known in the valley for her steadiness and her careful hands, helping her mother with the birthing work when she was needed, keeping the dairy's books with a precision her father came to rely on more than he ever quite admitted. She met Caleb Winter at 20, a hard-working young rancher from the valley's eastern edge, and their marriage, though modest, was a contented one, built on the same quiet partnership her own parents had modeled. Caleb admired his wife's practical mind and her refusal to write anything off as worthless before she had examined it properly. And in the years of their marriage, as her own parents passed, first her mother to a fever, and then her father some years later, Nora and Caleb took over the dairy and the Icehouse themselves, continuing the same careful seasonal rhythm Silas had taught his daughter from childhood, never once suspecting what the Icehouse floor had been quietly keeping cold and hidden. Caleb Winter died in the typhoid outbreak that swept through Larkspur in the spring of 1891, leaving Nora a widow at 31, with no children. A modest dairy operation she now had to run entirely alone, and, as she discovered only in the weeks after his funeral, a debt she had never known existed. Caleb had, some years before, quietly mortgaged the farm to the Larkspur Trust Bank to cover a bad season's losses, intending, as his hastily scrawled ledger entries suggested, to pay it back gradually before anyone need worry over it, a plan that died with him before it could be completed. The bank's agent, a precise, unsentimental man named Harlan Voss, called on Nora within a month of the funeral to inform her, not unkindly, but without any particular warmth either, that the note was due in full and that the farm would need to be sold to satisfy it, since a widow with no income beyond a small dairy herd represented, in the bank's careful accounting, too great a risk to be allowed further time. There was no cruelty in his manner, only the flat, procedural coldness of a man executing a policy he had executed many times before, and within 2 months, the farm, the herd, and the house had all been sold at auction to satisfy the debt, leaving Nora with nothing but what she could carry, and a small purse containing $2.40, the last of what she had managed to set aside from selling her own mother's silver hairbrush, and a quilt she could not bear to keep, once she had nowhere left to hang it. She did not argue with the auction, for she had learned from both her parents that dignity often meant accepting hard facts cleanly, rather than fighting battles already lost. But she did notice, standing at the edge of the crowd on auction day, that no one among the assembled buyers seemed to want the old icehouse at the property's edge, a squat, windowless structure with a partially caved roof that most in attendance dismissed as worthless, fit only for tearing down for scrap lumber. She approached Harlan Voss directly and asked what the bank would take for it alone, and he told her, with the faint bemusement of a man humoring a widow's odd attachment to a useless outbuilding, that $2 would settle it, since the bank had no interest in the expense of demolishing a structure with no resale value. Nora counted out every coin she had left into his palm without hesitation, and more than one onlooker shook their head at the sight of it, calling it, in tones of pity rather than malice, the last sad gesture of a grieving widow, too shocked by her losses to think clearly about what she was doing. It felt that way to Nora, too, if she was honest with herself, as she walked the short distance to stand before the Icehouse that first evening, with nowhere else in the world to go, though some small, stubborn part of her, the part her father had planted so many years before, at the edge of that very structure, told her that a plain little shed was rarely as empty as it looked. The first days inside the Icehouse were spent in the humbling labor of making a windowless timber shed livable, and Nora approached the work the way she approached everything, without complaint, treating the labor as a kind of steadying comfort against her grief. She patched the caved section of roof with salvaged shingle, bartered from a sympathetic neighbor, cleared the packed sawdust from the storage floor to make room for a narrow cot and a small stove she had managed to keep from the auction, and began, out of both necessity and the old habit her father had instilled in her, to examine the Icehouse's double-walled construction more carefully than she ever had as a child, curious whether any of the old timber framing might be salvaged or repurposed now that the structure no longer served its original purpose. It was in clearing the deepest layer of old sawdust from beneath the floor's loose center boards, work she undertook mainly to give the space better drainage, that her spade struck something that was not stone or timber, but the muffled, deliberate resistance of oilcloth wrapped tight around some solid, rectangular object, buried far deeper in the packing than any ice block had ever been set. She worked at the sawdust around it for the better part of an hour, uncovering by lantern light a bundle wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and blackened with over 20 years beneath the ice, and inside, remarkably preserved by the cold, dry environment the Icehouse had faithfully maintained for 2 decades, she found a cloth-bound diary, its cover embossed with the initials TD, and tucked into its back pages, a single folded letter and a small tintype photograph of 2 men standing arm in arm before a half-finished barn, one of whom she recognized, with a jolt, as a much younger version of her own father. Nora sat back on her heels, in the lantern's wavering light, and understood immediately, with the same instinct that had once told her father which sawdust needed replacing, that these things had been hidden here on purpose, sealed away by a man who had never returned to claim them. It took Nora 3 careful evenings to work the diary's brittle pages apart without tearing them, and what she read there, slowly and by lamplight, unspooled a story more than 20 years old that reached back further into the Larkspur Valley's history than she had ever imagined her own life could touch. The diary belonged to Thaddeus Doyle, the very neighbor and friend her mother had spoken of, only in careful, unfinished sentences, and it recorded, in a plain, earnest hand, the early years of the Doyle and Ellery families, settling side by side in the valley, until abruptly, in an entry dated the spring Nora was born, the tone shifted, growing anguished and confused, describing a terrible night when Thaddeus's young son, barely more than a toddler, had wandered from the Doyle homestead and been found, hours later, and gravely ill from exposure, inside the Elleris's ice house, having apparently crawled beneath a stack of sawdust-covered ice blocks, seeking warmth from the cold night air, in the worst possible place a small child could hide. The boy had survived, but only barely, and in the frightened aftermath, as families searched for someone to blame for how close tragedy had come, ugly words had passed between the 2 households, words neither Thaddeus nor Silas had ever fully explained to their children, accusations flung in panic and grief that neither man could quite take back once the fear had passed. The letter, when Nora unfolded it, filled in what the diary only implied. It was written by Thaddeus to Silas, though it appeared, from a note scrawled across its top in a different hand, never to have been delivered, and in it, Thaddeus apologized, with raw, unguarded honesty, for the accusations he had made that terrible night, admitting he had spoken in blind panic and had wrongly blamed Silas's household for failing to properly secure the ice house, when in truth, as Thaddeus had come to understand, once his own grief settled, the fault lay with no one but the unpredictable curiosity of a frightened toddler and the ordinary carelessness that befalls every family raising children on a working farm. He wrote that he intended to deliver the letter personally and mend what his panic had broken, that Silas's friendship had meant more to him than any argument born of terror for his son's life, and that he hoped, once the letter reached him, that the 2 families might find their way back to what they had once been. The diary's final entry, dated only days after the letter, in a hand grown suddenly terse and clipped, recorded only that the Doyle family had decided, after all, to sell their land and move on to Idaho, that some hurts, once spoken aloud in the worst possible way, could not be easily unspoken, and that Thaddeus feared the friendship was beyond repairing, whether or not the letter was ever sent. It never was. whether by his own second thoughts or some accident of the packing that concealed it. The letter had gone into the Icehouse with the diary, instead of into Silas Ellery's hands, and the two families had parted, without either side ever learning the other had wanted, quite desperately, to reconcile. Nora sat with this discovery for a long while, before she understood its full weight, turning back through the diary's pages, and Thaddeus's aching, unsent letter, until the shape of the old wound became unmistakable to her. Two men who had loved each other as brothers had been driven apart by a single terrifying night, and the panicked words it produced, and neither had ever known that the other regretted those words as bitterly as he did. A misunderstanding so complete that it had rewritten the whole shape of both families' lives, sending the Doyles away from the only home their children had known, and leaving her own father, she now understood, carrying a grief he had never once explained to her. She thought of her mother's careful, unfinished sentences about a terrible misunderstanding, and understood now that Margaret had likely known some fragment of the truth without ever having proof enough to say more. Tucked into the very back of the diary, Nora found one final entry, added, judging by the ink, some years after the others, in a hand grown older and more tired, in which Thaddeus, writing from Idaho, confessed that he thought of Silas Ellery every winter when the first frost came, and that he had never stopped wishing he had found the courage to deliver that letter himself, instead of trusting it, foolishly, to a hiding place he never returned to retrieve. The Larkspur Valley in 1891 had mostly forgotten the old falling out between the Ellerys and the Doyles, for it had happened before most of the valley's current residents had settled there, but the consequences of it lingered in ways Nora had never fully appreciated until now. For Thaddeus Doyle's grandson, a sharp, ambitious banker named Harlan Voss, the very agent who had foreclosed on her own farm, had grown up hearing only a fragment of the old story, a bitter, second-hand account, passed down through his mother, that painted the Ellery family as the ones who had driven the Doyles from their home, through cruelty and false blame, a grievance Harlan had carried quietly into his career, never quite realizing, until Nora herself pieced it together and worked up the courage to bring the diary to him, that his own grandfather's unsent letter had told an entirely different, far gentler story than the one his family had passed down in anger. Nora did not go to Harlan Voss first, with what she had found, uncertain how a man who had so recently and coldly foreclosed on her would receive evidence connecting them. But circumstance forced the matter when she sought out the valley's oldest surviving residents to help verify the diary's account, and word reached Harlan through his own mother, who still lived in the valley, and who wept, upon hearing of the diary's existence, that she had spent her whole life believing her grandfather had been wronged beyond forgiveness. Harlan came to the Icehouse himself within the week, not with the smooth, practiced coldness of a bank agent this time, but with something rawer and more uncertain, and Nora, understanding that this was not the moment for caution or negotiation, but for simple honesty, handed him the diary and the letter without hesitation, and let him read Thaddeus Doyle's own words for himself. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation Nora might have expected from a man in his position, but something quieter and more difficult, as Harlan Voss sat on an overturned bucket outside the very icehouse his foreclosure had reduced Nora to owning, reading his great-grandfather's unsent apology by lantern light, with an expression Nora would later describe only as a man watching an old grievance he had carried his whole life quietly come apart in his hands. He did not apologize for the foreclosure itself, for the debt had been real and the bank's policies not his alone to set aside. But something in him shifted all the same, and in the weeks that followed, as word of the diary's discovery spread through the valley, the way such stories always did, Harlan Voss did something few in Larkspur had ever seen a bank agent do, quietly petitioning the Larkspur Trust Bank's regional office to establish a modest hardship fund for widows and families facing foreclosure, under circumstances similar to Nora's own, funded in part from his own salary, and administered, at his specific and rather unusual request, jointly by himself and Nora Winter, the two of them meeting monthly in what had once been the Icehouse, and had since become, through Nora's careful renovations, a small office and community meeting space. There were smaller reconciliations too, the kind that mattered enormously to the people living them, even if the valley's larger history would never record them. For Harlan arranged, through careful correspondence, for his mother, and the last of Thaddeus Doyle's Idaho-based descendants, to finally read the letter that should have reached Silas Ellery over 2 decades before, and the reunion that followed, a modest gathering held one autumn afternoon at the old Ellery homestead site, with the surviving Doyles traveling back to Larkspur for the first time in a generation, brought a kind of quiet closure that neither family had thought possible. Nora herself, standing at the edge of that gathering, understood that what had begun as her own desperate $2 purchase of a worthless shed had become something far larger than her own survival, though her survival had mattered too, deeply, to a woman who had stood at auction with nothing but a handful of coins and a stubborn belief that a plain thing was rarely as empty as it looked. She kept the Icehouse, expanding it modestly, as the years and the hardship fund's small successes allowed, and it stood for years afterward, at the edge of what had once been the Ellery Dairy, no longer a windowless shed nobody wanted, but something closer to a landmark, the place in Larkspur Valley, where old debts, of money and of the heart alike, were quietly and patiently made right. She had been 31, and utterly without a home, when she counted out $2.40 for a ruined icehouse nobody else wanted, and there were those in Larkspur who had called it the saddest kind of foolishness. But Nora Winter had learned, first at her father's icehouse, and then, in the patient work of finding worth in what others discarded, that the plainest, most overlooked things are rarely as empty as they appear, that what keeps a place steady and cold and useful is often working quietly beneath the surface long after everyone else has stopped looking. She had not gone looking for a lost friendship or a generation-old wound when she cleared that sawdust to improve her drainage. She had been looking only for a way to make a hard winter more bearable, and had found instead a 20-year-old letter waiting quietly to finally be delivered. What she restored in the end was never really about the diary, or even about her own survival, though both mattered enormously to a widow with nothing left. It was about 2 families' friendship, broken by panic and unspoken regret, finally allowed to heal across a generation. It was about a valley, remembering that the quietest, most overlooked things, an old diary, a windowless shed, a widow with $2 in her purse, sometimes carry within them everything needed to make a broken thing whole again. Thank you for spending this time with Nora Winter's story, and with all of us here. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that hidden worth is still worth, even when the world has long since stopped looking for it. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps something as small and forgotten as an old icehouse nobody else wanted. We read every story you share with us, and we are always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.